Okay, we're live. Hi, I'm Bryce Hancock.
I'm Lindsay, here for another week.
Right, Mile High Recovery Chat. Today we're talking with David Whitesock from Commonly Well and the Recovery Capital Index. He actually spent some time here in Colorado, in Denver. Do you remember? You might not have heard about this. It was called Face It Together.
I don't think I heard of that. No.
My understanding is it was like a group of like recovery coaches, and he was the head of it. And they had, I don't know, they had some success for a while, but like as business owners, sometimes things go awry. I remember he was looking for a space at one point, and that's where I met him, and we were renting space, but I don't think it was going to work for him.
But, well, there you go. What's happening in your world today, Bryce? What's going on over there?
I just ended my week of parenting, so I'm in like full dad mode. My kids come every other week, and I had them both, and I just gave Oliver, my little one, back 30 minutes ago, 45 minutes ago or so.
Is that why you still have the baby stuff on the shirt? Did you get it off?
I do. I have baby drool. I think I got it off, but yeah, I just had baby drool on my shirt.
So you're kid free, and you're just doing like life.
Yeah.
Bryce in it.
So next Thursday, you'll see a different, like I'll have like a different vibe. Like I'll be in a different mood. You'll see, or maybe you won't see. I don't know.
I mean, you know what? I'll be the first to let you know if I notice a difference between Dad Bryce and Bryce the man, just right. The man as is. Yeah.
So you're back from Florida. You've been back a while now, right?
I'm back from Florida. I got back Sunday. We had Martin Luther King Day on Monday, and had a easier transition into the week. However, I mean, I think January is just crazy in general. I feel like I've been drinking from a fire hydrant all week, and I'm starting to prune a little bit, and I'm not thirsty anymore, and I'd really just kind of like to go take a nap again. I talk about naps a lot, and
right.
They're like a favorite thing of mine the closer I get to 40,
Yeah.
And I'm not 40 yet, but it's knocking on the door.
Okay, so naps, there you go.
No, not next. I'll be 39 next month. So okay. I get another trip around the sun before I go into a different age bucket.
All right. Well, let's get David on. Let's go ahead and start talking about
I love it.
David.
Hi, David.
Right. Lindsay, hello.
Hi. Hello.
Welcome.
Great to see you both.
David's coming to us from New York. Where are you in New York?
I'm on the western foothills of the Adirondacks, a little village called Potsdam.
Okay. All right. So your new company is called Commonly Well.
Yes.
Right. I watched your LinkedIn. I mean, I watched your podcast, your TED Talk. You did a TED Talk. I watched that, and you talked a little bit about your story. You had a remarkable amount of DUIs back in the day. Yeah. And you kind of gave credit, I believe, to the judge who stuck you in a sober house, correct? Made you attend recovery meetings and tested you for a long time, right?
Yeah. So this was 2005, and there was 3 towns or 3 counties in South Dakota, which is where I was at, testing a brand new program, twice daily breathalyzers. So a lot of states do twice daily breathalyzers, but this was brand new. The state of South Dakota had invented it. And so the 2 big cities where Mount Rushmore is at, Rapid City and Sioux Falls, those were the 2 big cities. But then there was a judge in this tiny little town who is tired of dealing with this issue. And she's like, I want to do this. And in comes me with a 5th DUI and 12 years of just devastation. Yeah, 5. Plus 5 driving under suspensions, if we want to go down the rap sheet. And she's like, I am going to put you on this. I'm going to keep you sober for 5 years. So once a day for 5 years, I had to go, or twice a day for 5 years, I had to go and do it. It lasted 2.5 years because, I kept my nose clean and was able to get off. But yeah, so plus meetings every day. It was a wild ride.
So we talk
What
about
happens if, wait, I'm curious. What happens if you travel or anything during that time? Like, are you like bound to the state of South Dakota and like that jurisdiction?
I was, yeah.
Wow.
So I had to get permission to leave and go home. My family's from North Dakota. So I had to write a letter and get permission. And yeah, I was owned by the state.
And so we talk about it a lot, that like one of the most successful treatment programs is for doctors and for pilots. When I was in treatment, there were a lot of pilots, and they have up to 5 years of that kind of supervision with testing and aftercare and therapy. And they have like a 90% success rate. So,
for some people, it's really hard to lose their liberty like that. They want to sort of have the freedom to discover and feel what it's like to be in recovery without those restrictions. But I think for some of us, if we've got those sort of things that we don't want to lose, having that type of structure, it's invaluable. I wouldn't be here without it.
I agree. And like a lot of people will because some people will be on the streets and get sober. They'll go to an AA meeting and something will happen. But the problem is there's like an internal shift that happens, so we can't recreate that. But what you can recreate is 2.5 years of breathalyzers, or you go to jail.
Yeah. What was really fascinating about that was 6 months in, I was living in the sober home, and I couldn't really get a job because my previous work was as a broadcaster. So I went to the meat packing plant and tried to get a job there because that's what we do. We go get just the next available job, and they wouldn't hire me because I didn't have the experience. And so I had gone to college, and I thought, well, I'll just go back to college. Wrote the judge a letter, said, hey, the University of North Dakota will take me back. And I had a 1.9 GPA, which they were like, well, this will be an exception. And the judge wrote me back and said, that's great. I want you to go back to school, but you're not going to North Dakota. You can stay in the state of South Dakota. And so that's what I did. I just went back to school and went all in. But without that structure, it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked at all.
But you did really well in school, correct?
A lot better than I did before. Yeah, no, I did okay. It was when I was back in school. I thought I was going to go back to radio, and that was easy. They had a nice journalism program at the University of South Dakota, but I took an elective, constitutional law. I just had to fill out the semester, and the professor was a public defender, and we had to give an oral argument as if you were arguing to the Supreme Court of the United States. So I gave my argument. Apparently it was good. And so she had somebody come after me to join the mock trial team. And I said, no, I'm already working for the newspaper, the school newspaper. I'm not taking on anything else. And she didn't take no for an answer. Long story short, I joined the mock trial team, and she listened to my story and said, wow, you're wasting your life if you go back into radio. You've got to become a lawyer.
Really?
And that was one of those sort of lollipop moments. If you've seen that TED Talk, where she put a bug in my ear, and next thing you know, 2.5 years later, I'm going to law school.
So when I met you, you were doing Face It together.
Yeah. And
it was, am I wrong? It was recovery coaching, right?
Yeah, recovery coaching.
Right.
Kind of on steroids. A lot of science behind it, but really just pure coaching.
And it was going well. I was hearing about you, and you guys were growing, and then something happened to your space, correct?
Well, a couple of things happened. We came from Sioux Falls, which about 250,000 people, and we had an opportunity to expand to Denver. So we went from 250,000 people to 2.5 million. And the economic dynamics of that were really challenging.
Yeah.
To try to keep that afloat. And it was and then COVID hit. And so, we're dealing with a really expensive space. COVID had to shrink. And so it was hard, but we still, we had all the technology. So we were able to just put coaches at home and kind of still do the thing without having the big, huge space that we had built in Denver.
So I feel like, so your company now is Commonly Well, and you're gonna talk about the Recovery Capital Index, but I kind of feel like when you were doing Face It Together, what was your tagline? Like, we're gonna solve addiction by not solving addiction. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean that's my tagline. Yeah, I believe we'll solve addiction without solving for addiction.
Okay. So explain that.
I think all of us who have a story around here, we know that there are, if we play it back, we rewind our story enough, we can get to the underlying things that had nothing to do with the drugs or the alcohol. Okay. So for me, severe anxiety and debilitating depression. And for a while, the depressant of alcohol helped,
Right.
But then it turned into a disaster. And then I started living in places that didn't support anything to what I needed. And you can just start to look at where you live, who your friends are, economic circumstances, all of these other drivers that if you fix those things, you eliminate the reason why people turn to substances for coping and for release. I see the Buddha behind you, Bryce, right? I've got a Buddha behind me. Flowers behind you, Lindsay. We find things that give us joy, but if we're never taught that, or if they're not ingrained in the fabric of our community, we're gonna go to the next thing that gives us the most immediate pleasure: sex, money, drugs. And some of those things might be good, if you want to take them in limited amounts, but for some of us, it's disaster.
Moderation.
So, solve addiction, we don't solve for addiction.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of this treatment industry, I kind of feel like we do the same thing and we kind of believe the same things. Like, a lot of this industry is like where you get sober. Where'd you go to rehab? Where'd you go to treatment? Which is great, right? But real recovery starts the day after. And then these things you're talking about, and like kind of like what the Recovery Capital Index addresses, it doesn't happen in 28 days. It happens after that, right? As you start to unpack these things you're talking about underneath the addiction.
I would even go yes, I agree with that. But I would take it one step further. And I'll go back to the story of the courtroom with the judge in my own case. As I was being sentenced, she looked at me and she said, "David, you've got 5 years of college. You were going to the North Dakota State University for architecture. You failed out, but you started in college. You had a 10-year career in broadcasting. You had a professional life. You have family who care about you. You clearly are somewhat intelligent." I laugh as I say that.
No, you really are.
Well, thank you. It's subjective.
Yeah.
And she's like, "You have all of these things. You should not be here." Right? So I think there's a thread of, we try to draw a line. You're not well, and then you're in recovery. I would like to say the thread of recovery actually starts long before we actually get into recovery. The trick is all of those things are the same. It's just, when do we start to apply them in a way that it's kind of natural medicine for us? And if you start to measure all of those things around us, that'll help those of us that are already struggling to get well. But we can take what we learn there and reverse engineer it back into our communities like Denver and go, let's look at a place like 5 Points or something. What do we need to do? And how do we need to sort of look at that community and say, what needs to happen here so that this recovery capital actually meets people when they're nowhere near addiction and they never end up into that state? That's sort of my big dream, my big vision, is we can look at these pockets of communities and figure out, well, what do we really need for people to thrive and never have to get to addiction?
So it's like a proactive approach versus like everything being reactionary after everything has occurred.
Yeah. So I'll nerd out for 20 seconds.
Yes.
If you read Rishi Manchanda, he is a physician in Los Angeles. He gave a TED talk called Moving Upstream. And he's got a book called The Upstreamist. And he talks about this too. So it's just moving upstream. And he tells a story of a woman he was helping who had respiratory problems. And she kept coming in and kept coming in. And he and the nurses kept giving her, asthma inhalers and all kinds of steroids for her lungs. And she kept coming back. And he finally said to one of his nurses, follow her home. The nurse goes to her house. She gets invited into the apartment, and her apartment is covered in mold. So they were never going to solve the problem until they solved the mold in the house. No medicine could solve that. So it's really kind of looking deeper and beyond. And so for folks in addiction, it could be socioeconomic, right? Financial challenges. It could be just a depressed community. It could be a lot of things. But we can look around and bring the community together and say, this sidewalk that doesn't quite make it to the grocery store, let's get the sidewalk to go all the way, because the guy like me who had to ride my bike for 3 years could get to the grocery store in a snowstorm if that sidewalk existed and it was plowed. And I wouldn't need the frustration of not doing that and just giving up and going home and saying, I think I'll drink.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens.
Of course it is. It sounds ridiculous. That's why I laugh, but that's like, well, I can't get to the grocery store. I might as well get drunk, right?
It seems illogical, right?
Right.
To normal people.
Right.
That's what happened.
People.
And then we ask, well, why did you drink again? That's just dumb. Well, the sidewalk isn't fixed.
Right. Well, right. All right. So I'm going to bring Sarah Zubrin, our Chief Clinical Officer, on, and she's going to just add to the conversation. So did you go from, so I'll just bring her on right now. Hello, Sarah.
Hey, Sarah.
Did you go, so you're, so Commonly Well, what is that? And how did Face It Together dovetail into that or contribute to that?
Yeah, when I joined Face It Together in 2012, about 2 months in of my work, I was challenged to come up with a measurement for addiction. So I was asked, you got 30 days, figure out how to measure recovery. And I don't know how to do that. I'm not a statistician. But we had funders and hospital systems and grantors who wanted something more than just David standing up in a room and telling his recovery story. So we needed data. And I dove into all the work from William White and all the stuff about recovery capital. But that kind of took a turn because I got connected to folks who were creating a new measurement called the Social Progress Index. So if you're familiar with economics at all and how we measure countries, we measure our success around countries in economic terms, GDP. Well, that misses civic engagement. It misses social issues. And so the Social Progress Index was looking, well, how do we take all this data, this qualitative data that already exists in the world, to measure social issues, social progress? And I was just jumbling all of that together. And so over the course of 7 years at Face It Together, I was sort of creating that instrument specific for us. And in the last year, when my role changed at Face It Together and I had to leave to save the organization, if you will, I had the opportunity to take this thing that I invented and then bring it into a new company, Commonly Well, and then actually bring it out into the world so that more organizations could use it.
So you're measuring well-being in sobriety as a measure, and I like that because for a lot of us, it's like either you're sober, and if you're abstinent, that's the measure, right? And that's not really, it's not real, and it's not really good enough because it doesn't measure your happiness, like how well you are, function in society or in your family. And so that's the kind of stuff you're talking about with this, correct?
Yeah, I like to use the example of employment is a really good one. Like a lot of places will check a box, we got Lindsay employed, we're done. But what we don't know and what we're not asking is, Lindsay, does your employer support your current state in recovery and want to help you in that process? Is the culture good for you to be well? Do you actually like what you do? And for sometimes you got to just suck it up. You got to work, right? That's life.
Right.
But sometimes that'll take a toll. And if we don't start to ask those questions, then people can't self-discover and find ways to get to employment that actually is much more meaningful in their day-to-day. Like, for instance, I worked at Subway for 2.5 years, as a 32-year-old going to law school. I didn't like seeing my professors come in the line at noon. That was kind of embarrassing. But at the same time, I'm OCD. I like to make the best sandwich. I dive into it and I get sidetracked. So you can find meaning and joy in these things, but that takes a little bit of work. And it takes some coaching to get people there.
Well, and I think it goes back to are we looking for the right now, or are we looking for what lights our fire and drives our passion? And so often this is the problem with the recovery community, is we get to the right now and we want to solve it right now. But we see so many people with long-term sobriety, but not long-term recovery, who have no passion and don't know what the meaning of life is for them. So it's so true. Like, even making that Subway sandwich, you can get a lot of life satisfaction from that. And that's like the crux of recovery, I think.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point. This is kind of digging into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which really isn't a hierarchy. It's sort of two things. How do we find transcendence, something bigger and greater than us? But also, how do we self-actualize? How do we engage in a process that allows us to own the process of discovery? And I think all too often it was my challenge in recovery groups and a lot of different things was, well, just go to this thing every week. Just go meet these people every month. But people are at different stages of the journey. And I always felt like I was being brought down to certain levels when I wanted to go higher. And there are times to do that because you want to help. But there are other times when you're there for you and you want to grow. And that's a tough challenge to kind of work through.
Yeah, some of the most amazing people I've ever met are in the rooms, as they say. However, there are also some people in the rooms, like it seems like a lot of people will go in to meetings and they'll talk about their first year of sobriety for 20 years. And I got to a point where I wanted more. I wanted some sort of purpose, right? And that's kind of what the 12th step is, right? And the 11th step and things like that. But see, people just talk about step one all day long. And myself, I felt like there needed to be a greater purpose, kind of like what you're talking about.
Yeah. And these are things that we can actually measure. We've been doing it in the happiness realm for 30 years. And I know that's a soft measure. If you get into the data science world and into the research and evaluation world, people will roll their eyes and be like, oh, you work in happiness. Well, we've been measuring it for 30 years. There's a solid foundation on how to do this. And there are ways to do it. And we can bring that into the realm of recovery. And I think it can actually really shake up the way we actually talk about this journey that a lot of us go on and what it actually really means.
So you have the Recovery Capital Index, right? And then who would be the consumer of this? Who would you want to have this information and what would they do with it?
So it operates out of programs. So treatment providers, behavioral health organizations, recovery organizations. It's not consumer focused, if you want to put it in those terms. So it's part of that program, but patients and clients take the survey at any point in the continuum. And then that data and that information is presented back in the care process. So it's quantified and it's the qualification of the information. So, we can see that your loneliness question is, improving. You're improving on your loneliness. But we also have a score for your personal capital. We have a score for your cultural capital and your social capital. And so with the scoring, we can actually see and track against the numbers over time. And it's not that we're constantly always trying to go up. I could show you my recovery capital for the last year, and it dropped 20 points in May. Why? Because the world was on fire and I changed jobs and started a company. It better go down.
Look at COVID.
Yeah.
But if you're mindful in it, now you can sort of work with it.
So, that's perfect because I'm thinking to our STEPS program, which is a new program we introduced. It's a year-long program.
Yeah.
And so this would be something that would be perfect to kind of track someone as they've started the program out, and then to be able to follow them as they've grown in that year, like check, just as baselines and benchmarks. True?
Well, yeah, that's one of the challenges that we've had in addiction and recovery for a long time is that long-term measurement.
Yeah.
Bryce, you mentioned earlier, like the HPAP programs, the health professional programs, those are 4 and 5 years long, and they've got really solid data in those instances. But typically it's use and utilization data. It's not well-being or recovery data. So if we could get there, in sort of the generalized field of care, that I think that will have immense ramifications.
So you need large populations to measure this data, right?
Yeah, it works well kind of on its own in smaller groups. We're working with Homeward Pikes Peak in Colorado Springs. They do about 400 or 500 people a month. That's a good size population.
That's good. Those are good stats.
Yeah, and we've got, it would be nice to have tens of thousands, maybe even 1 million with this type of data, because that big data will reveal insights that aren't available to us today. But you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, I agree. But yeah, I do. And it's like a long conversation, right? But it's like, so why aren't treatment centers, in my opinion, why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they following up this initial 30 days of care with case management for years and measuring this data for years instead of the revolving door, right?
Well, the short answer is the business model. The business model
Right.
isn't for that. It's fee for service, and insurance pays for 17 days or 30 days, and that's what they get paid to do.
Right.
Well, and we're not invested, right? Like short-term treatment programs aren't invested in long-term outcomes because it doesn't benefit them. You do have like really strong alumni services, but I definitely agree, like managing and following up on the well-being of people long-term and case management and recovery coaches are like the exact whole in building and keeping recovery capital.
Yeah, I mean, even if you have just an average experience with substance use disorder, it's still going to take you 2 to 3 years to get to a place where you feel somewhat stable. So
That normalcy, yeah.
Yeah, and that's that. I think that's, to put it just simple for most people. How do we get to that 2 to 3 year period of saying this is going to take a while? We got to let this germinate a little bit, and people wear Fitbits for a long time. You can do a survey for 10 minutes or 20 minutes every 30 days.
And I've been working with some of the same folks for years on end now, right? And you see as their recovery evolves, so do the issues that they need support around. And so often we forget the like secondary healing part that comes with recovery. So I get really excited to talk to people who are super invested in that like long-term part, because it's like we get to a certain number of days and we're like, we're cured, or we cured our client, we cured our patient. And that's not how it works. We just have new problems. We problem up.
Yeah, and in this environment of the world that we've been living in, where it's so socially and civically challenged with a lot of social justice issues and political issues, those things are ever changing, right? We could live in a town that's great, that has great psychological safety, and then all of a sudden, the politics change around us, or something happens like in Minneapolis. Well, if you've got 20 years sobriety and that comes along, how do you plan for that, right? Unless you have a day-to-day month-to-month regimen of mindfulness and therapy and a lot of different things, fitness, nutrition, unless you're really clued in, those things will wallop you and you won't know what to do, because that alumni program is probably not relevant to you anymore. No offense to all the providers in the room. They'd want that to be the case, but people grow.
I don't think I'll see anyone with 20 years coming in.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, David, thank you for joining us.
This was
Thanks,
great.
David.
Thank you, Bryce.
It's been awesome. I love what you're doing, and I'm going to keep following what you're doing.
Likewise, I love what y'all are doing too. You're really shaking up the dynamic of how we engage in this process for a longer period of time, and I think that's great. Keep doing it.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks.
See you guys later.
Bye.